I never expected that a flooded apartment would be the best thing that ever happened to me. Before the storm, my life was a carefully curated museum of one. Each object in its place, each day a replica of the last. I was the silent curator and the sole exhibit, a life ordered to the precise millimeter to keep the chaos of the world and the messiness of my own heart safely behind velvet ropes. My work as a graphic designer fed this isolation, allowing me to build entire worlds on a screen, worlds I could control, where color palettes and kerning were the only variables that mattered. My apartment, on the ground floor, was my sanctuary and my fortress, its walls holding the quiet hum of my meticulously structured loneliness. Then there was Liam. He lived 3 floors up in 3B. He wasn't just a neighbor. He was the architect who had designed the entire building. This fact alone placed him in a different category of existence. He hadn't just moved into a space. He had conceived it, drawn its lines, and breathed life into its steel and glass skeleton. To me, he was less a man and more a myth, a creator god who occasionally walked the hallways he'd brought into being. I saw him in fragments, glimpses that I collected like rare artifacts. The solid set of his broad shoulders as he carried groceries in from his car. The low, rumbling sound of his voice, a calm baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards when he took a call in the corridor. The fleeting scent of his cologne, something clean and woodsy, like cedar and sandalwood, that lingered in the elevator long after he'd gone. He was tall, moved with an unhurried confidence, and had a way of looking at you, a direct, steady gaze, that made me feel entirely transparent, as if he could see the jumbled, anxious wiring beneath my calm facade. The barrier between us felt as solid and immense as the concrete foundation of the building itself. He was confident, I was anxious. He was a man who shaped the physical world. I was a man who hid from it behind a screen. And, of course, there was the most insurmountable wall of all, the assumption, built on a brief sighting of him with a laughing, beautiful woman months ago, that he was straight. So he existed in my mind as a piece of art I could admire from a distance, something beautiful and unattainable. My feelings for him were a quiet, secret ache, a file hidden so deep on my internal hard drive that I could almost pretend it wasn't there. I cataloged his habits, the early morning departures, the late-night returns, the sound of his heavy boots on the stairs, and told myself it was simple neighborly awareness, nothing more. It was a lie, but it was an orderly one. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, announcing itself not with a sudden crack of thunder, but with a slow, ominous darkening of the sky. The air grew heavy, thick with a metallic scent of ozone and impending rain. It was a disruption to the clean, crisp autumn air I'd grown accustomed to, an unwelcome intrusion of chaos. The first drops of rain were fat and loud, splattering against my window like thrown pebbles. Then came the wind, a low moan that grew into a guttural howl, rattling the glass in its frame. The familiar, comforting sounds of my life, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the quiet click of my laptop keys, were swallowed by the rising symphony of the storm. I tried to work, to lose myself in the comforting geometry of a new logo design, but the building groaned around me. The lights flickered once, twice, a nervous twitch before they surrendered completely. The world plunged into an abrupt, suffocating darkness. The hum died. My screen went black. The silence that followed was more jarring than the wind. It was a dead, empty quiet, the sound of my controlled world shutting down. For a while, I just sat there, a ghost in my own apartment, listening to the rain lash against the building. Then I heard a new sound, a soft, insidious trickling. I lit my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. I followed the sound to my front door. A dark, slick tendril of water was creeping across the welcome mat, a sinister invitation. My heart hammered against my ribs. The ground floor. Of course. The lowest point, the most vulnerable. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I scrambled, throwing my laptop, its charger, and my external hard drive, my entire professional life, into a waterproof bag. The water was coming faster now, a shallow, spreading pool reflecting the frantic dance of my flashlight. My carefully ordered world was literally dissolving around me, the water soaking the legs of my desk, creeping toward the rug I'd spent a month choosing. My fortress was breached. My sanctuary was drowning. Clutching my bag, I pulled open the door and stepped into the hallway, my bare feet landing in an inch of cold water. The emergency lights cast a sterile, greenish glow over everything, making the familiar corridor look like a scene from a horror film. I didn't know where to go. A hotel? A friend's place across town? The streets were probably flooded. I felt a primal, childlike urge to simply sit down and wait for it all to be over. That's when I saw him. A figure descending the main staircase, his silhouette solid and reassuring against the emergency lighting. It was Liam. He held a heavy-duty flashlight, its beams strong and steady, a stark contrast to my phone's pathetic glow. He was checking the lower floors, a captain checking on his ship in a storm. His gaze found me, standing in the water, clutching my bag like a life raft. "Julian, you okay?" His voice, that calm, low rumble, cut through my panic. I couldn't form words, just shook my head, gesturing numbly at the water seeping from my apartment. He swept the beam of his flashlight over my door, saw the growing puddle, and his expression shifted from concern to decision. There was no hesitation. "Come on," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You can't stay here. You're coming up to my place." Liam's apartment was another world. The moment the door closed, the howling of the wind was muted, the chaos of the flooded hallway locked away. Here it was calm. He had battery-powered lanterns placed strategically around the living room, casting a warm, flickering glow that felt more like a cozy campfire than an emergency. The space was a perfect reflection of him. Clean, modern lines, minimalist furniture, but with an inherent warmth that came from the textures of dark wood, worn leather, and soft-woven fabrics. It smelled like him. That familiar, grounding scent of sandalwood and cedar was the very air in the room, layered with the faint, comforting aroma of recently brewed coffee. "Here," he said, his voice gentle. He handed me a thick, plush towel. "You're soaked." I was. My jeans were heavy with water, and a chill was starting to seep into my bones. The awkward dance began then, a clumsy choreography of forced intimacy. I was a refugee in his pristine, ordered space, a disruption he was calmly managing. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a dark gray t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants. These should fit, more or less. I took them, my fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt straight up my arm, a spark of electricity in the dim, quiet room. "Thanks," I mumbled, my voice feeling small and inadequate. I changed in his bathroom, a space of slate tile and gleaming chrome. The t-shirt was, as he'd predicted, huge on me. The soft cotton fabric fell to my mid-thighs, and the sleeves hung past my elbows. But it was warm, and it smelled distinctly of his laundry detergent, and, more subtly, of him. Wearing his clothes felt like a transgression, a shocking, terrifying intimacy I had never allowed myself to even fantasize about. I was wrapped in his scent, a ghost wearing his skin. When I emerged, he had 2 steaming mugs on the coffee table. He gestured for me to sit on the leather sofa. It was soft and worn, sighing as I sank into it. He handed me a mug, and again, our hands brushed. This time I was ready for it, but the shock was no less potent. I wrapped my cold fingers around the warm ceramic, the heat a welcome anchor in the swirling sea of my anxiety. We sat in a strange, charged silence for a few moments, the only sounds the relentless drumming of the rain and the distant, mournful wail of a siren. I was hyper-aware of everything. The way the lantern light carved shadows across the strong lines of his face. The quiet, even rhythm of his breathing. The sheer physical presence of him next to me on the sofa. A solid mass of warmth that my body seemed to lean toward instinctively. A flower turning toward a distant sun. The physical distance between us was a mere foot of leather, but it felt like a chasm crackling with unspoken energy. "So," he finally said, his voice soft. "Bad night to be on the ground floor." A weak, self-deprecating laugh escaped me. "You could say that. I think my rug is officially a casualty." It was a stupid thing to say, but it was all I could manage. My mind, usually a whirlwind of overthinking, was completely blank. He smiled, a small, kind expression. "Rugs can be replaced." We fell into an easy, quiet rhythm of conversation. He asked about my work, and I found myself explaining the intricacies of typography and color theory to him, things I rarely spoke about with anyone. He listened intently, asking smart questions that showed he was genuinely interested. He wasn't just being polite. He was present. Then, in a moment of quiet, he gave me a glimpse behind his own carefully constructed walls. He stared out the large window at the rain-streaked darkness, his jaw tight for a second. This kind of weather, he started, then trailed off, as if deciding whether to continue. It makes me anxious. The admission was so unexpected it startled me. Liam, the unshakable architect, the calm center of this storm, was anxious. I was a kid, he continued, his voice lower now, more introspective. We had a storm like this, a big one. A tree fell on our house. Right over my bedroom. He let out a slow breath. No one was hurt, but I remember that sound. The splintering wood, the whole house groaning. For a split second, I thought the world was ending. He turned his gaze from the window back to me. It's stupid. I designed buildings to withstand this stuff for a living. I know the math. I know this place is solid as a rock. But still, that feeling never quite goes away. In that moment, he ceased to be the untouchable museum piece. The myth crumbled, replaced by a man who was just as susceptible to the ghosts of the past as I was. His vulnerability was a bridge, an unexpected path across the chasm I had imagined between us. My secret, quiet ache for him deepened into something more resonant, a feeling of profound, heart-stopping empathy. He wasn't just a collection of admirable traits anymore. He was real. As the hours bled into one another, it became clear the power wasn't coming back on any time soon. The storm raged without pause, a relentless assault on the city. My phone was nearly dead, and my apartment was a problem for the morning. My staying the night went from a possibility to an unspoken certainty. The conversation about sleeping arrangements was as awkward as I'd feared. It hung in the air between us, a heavy, unspoken question mark. Finally, Liam broke the silence, clearing his throat. Look, I only have the one bed. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was quickly learning meant he was uncertain. You should take it. I'm fine on the couch. No, I said, maybe too quickly. The thought of him, the man who had taken me in and shown me such kindness, sleeping on the couch while I took his bed felt fundamentally wrong. Absolutely not. I can take the couch. I'm the guest. It's not a comfortable couch for sleeping, he countered, a hint of a wry smile on his lips. I designed it for aesthetics, not practicality. One of my few regrets. We went back and forth like that for a minute, a polite, ridiculous duel of self-sacrifice. The unspoken third option shimmered in the space between us, too daring to voice. He was the one who finally said it, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing blueprints. It's a king-size bed, Julian. It's big enough. We can just share. If you're okay with that. My heart did a frantic, painful flip in my chest. Are you sure? The words came out as a whisper. He just nodded, his gaze steady. I'm sure. It's the logical solution. Logical. Of course. For him, it was a practical matter of square footage and body heat. For me, it felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. But I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Okay. Getting ready for bed was a sequence of quiet, stilted movements. He gave me a new toothbrush from a package under the sink. We moved around each other in the dim light of his bedroom, a silent, careful ballet, intensely aware of each other's proximity. The room was dominated by the bed, a vast expanse of dark gray duvet that looked both incredibly inviting and utterly terrifying. I got in first, sliding under the covers and immediately retreating to the farthest edge of the mattress, my back to the center. I lay there, rigid as a board, listening to the sound of him moving around the room. The mattress dipped as he got in on the other side. The space between us, a cool no-man's land of sheet and duvet, felt enormous, a canyon carved through the heart of the bed. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the distance. I could hear the soft, even sound of his breathing in the otherwise silent room. I focused on my own breath, trying to will my frantic heart to slow down, trying to appear relaxed, asleep. It was a hopeless performance. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, tuned to the presence of the man lying a few feet away from me. My ordered world had not just been flooded. It had been completely upended, and now I was lying in the dark, in the very bed of the man who occupied every corner of my secret thoughts. Hours seemed to pass. The storm outside began to soften, its fury abating into a steady, rhythmic drumming. I maintained my rigid position, my muscles aching with the strain of pretending to be asleep. I had almost convinced myself that I could get through this, that the night would pass, and in the morning we could pretend this bizarre intimacy had never happened. Then I felt it. A subtle shift in the mattress. A slight depression behind me. My breath caught in my throat. He was moving. My mind raced. He was just adjusting, getting comfortable, rolling over in his sleep. It meant nothing. I repeated the mantra in my head, a desperate plea to logic. But he wasn't rolling away. He was moving closer. Slowly, deliberately, the warmth at my back intensified. An arm, solid and heavy, brushed against my shoulder blade. It wasn't a fleeting touch. It stayed there, a point of searing contact. My entire body went still. This was not accidental. Sleep-heavy movements are clumsy, random. This was measured. This was intentional. My mind went completely blank, every anxious thought erased by a wave of pure, unadulterated sensation. He shifted again, a slow, silent slide across the sheets. Now his entire body was aligned with mine, the heat of his chest a solid wall against my back. His breath, warm and steady, ghosted over the sensitive skin of my neck, raising goosebumps. Then, his hand came to rest on my waist. The touch was feather-light at first, then settled with a gentle, confident pressure. It was not the possessive grip of a lover, nor the accidental placement of a limb in sleep. It was a question. It was an offering. His fingers were warm against the thin cotton of the t-shirt, his thumb resting just above my hip bone. The world stopped turning on its axis. My carefully constructed walls, already damaged by the flood, didn't just crack. They evaporated. There was nothing left but the darkness, the sound of the rain, and the shocking, undeniable reality of his hand on my body. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, suspended in a state of terrifying, exquisite disbelief, feeling the steady, calm beat of his heart against my back. It was everything I had ever wanted, and I was absolutely terrified. The morning arrived with a cruel, unflinching clarity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and painfully bright. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and erasing all the soft, forgiving shadows of the night before. The power was back on, announced by the sudden, intrusive hum of the building's climate control system. The intimacy of the darkness had evaporated with the dawn, leaving a thick, suffocating awkwardness in its place. When I woke, I was alone in the bed. His hand was gone. The warmth at my back was just a memory, a ghost of heat on the sheets. For a wild, disorienting moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it all. The storm, the flood, him moving closer, his hand on my waist. It felt too surreal, too much like a scene from a fantasy. I'd have been too scared to even script for myself. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee. He was staring at his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as I entered, and his expression was polite, neutral, distant. "Morning," he said, his voice the same calm, even tone as always. There was no trace of the night's intimacy in it. "Coffee's fresh." "Thanks," I mumbled, my voice rough with sleep and anxiety. I busied myself with getting a mug, pouring the coffee, adding milk, anything to avoid looking at him. The silence between us was a physical entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket. He didn't mention what had happened. He didn't mention his arm against my back or his hand on my waist. It was as if a collective amnesia had set in with the sunrise. "I called the building manager," he said, turning his attention back to his phone. "They're sending a crew to start pumping out the ground floor this morning. You should be able to get in and properly assess the damage in a few hours." His tone was all business. He was the architect again, the problem solver. The man who had confessed his anxieties about the storm, who had closed the distance between us and the dark, was gone. My anxiety, a dormant beast, woke up and began to roar. My mind started its vicious spiral. I had imagined it. Of course I had. It was wishful thinking, a dream conjured by stress and proximity. Or worse, it did happen, and he was just asleep, and now he was awake and horrified, trying to pretend it never occurred to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He regretted it. He was being polite because he felt sorry for me, this pathetic, flooded-out neighbor he'd been forced to take in. I had made everything weird. I had taken his kindness and twisted it into something it wasn't. I had ruined the simple, admirable distance that had defined our relationship. The chasm between us, which had felt so thrillingly bridged in the dark, now seemed wider and more impassable than ever. I needed to escape. The air in his apartment felt too thin to breathe. I should go, I said, my voice tight. I need to check on my things. You don't have to rush, he said, looking up from his phone again, but his gaze seemed to skim right past me. They won't be there for a while. No, I should go, I repeated, already moving toward the door, desperate to get back to my own space, even if it was a damp, chaotic mess. It was my mess. A mess I understood. I grabbed my bag, pulled on my still damp shoes, and paused at the door. Liam, thank you, I said stiffly, formally. For everything. I really appreciate it. Anytime, Julian, he said, his voice still holding that unnerving, polite distance. Let me know if you need anything. I nodded and fled. The walk down the 3 flights of stairs felt like a descent into hell. Each step echoed my internal monologue of self-recrimination. Fool. Idiot. You misread everything. You always do. By the time I reached my own water-damaged door, I had convicted myself on all charges. The verdict was in. I had ruined it. The rest of the day was a miserable blur. I dealt with the cleanup crew, my landlord, the initial call to my insurance company. I moved my sodden rug into the hallway and propped up furniture on blocks of wood. The physical chaos of my apartment was a perfect mirror for the emotional chaos raging inside me. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, my stomach clenched, terrified it might be him, terrified of the awkward encounter that would surely follow. Late that afternoon, when I was sitting on my salvaged sofa, staring at a damp wall, there was a knock on the door. My heart didn't just clench, it plummeted straight to the floor. I knew it was him. This was it. The talk. The, "I'm sorry if you got the wrong impression" speech. The polite but firm reestablishment of boundaries. I braced myself for the rejection I was so sure I deserved. I opened the door. Liam stood there, looking just as uncomfortable as I felt. He wasn't wearing the mask of polite distance anymore. He just looked nervous. It was the first time I had ever seen him look anything other than completely in control. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Can we talk?" I nodded mutely and stepped back to let him in. He walked into the middle of my damp, disordered living room and stood there, looking out of place amidst the mess. I didn't offer him a seat. I just stood by the door, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture against the blow I knew was coming. He took a deep breath, the kind you take before diving into cold water. "I wasn't asleep last night, Julian." The words hit me with the force of a physical impact. My carefully constructed narrative of delusion and misinterpretation shattered into a million pieces. He hadn't been asleep. It had been real. All of it. He saw the shock on my face and continued, his words coming out in a slight rush, as if he was afraid he'd lose his nerve. "I've wanted to talk to you for months. Not just about the weather or the building's maintenance schedule." He gave a small, humorless smile. "But I didn't know how. You're always so self-contained. In your own world. I figured you weren't interested. Or that I wasn't your type." He gestured vaguely around my apartment. "You're this creative, quiet person, and I'm just this guy who builds boxes. I thought you were the untouchable one. I put you on a pedestal." My own words, my own feelings, thrown back at me. He had felt the same way. The barrier I had perceived as being entirely of my own making, my own inadequacy, had been a two-way mirror. "This morning," he went on, his gaze finally meeting mine, raw and vulnerable. "You were so quiet, so distant. I was convinced I'd completely misread everything, that I'd crossed a line and made you uncomfortable. I thought I had ruined our friendship, or whatever this is." He took a step closer. "And that woman you saw me with, months ago? That was my sister. She was in town for the weekend. I'm not seeing anyone." The last piece of the wall crumbled into dust. The presumed heterosexuality, the final, insurmountable barrier, was just another illusion. Relief washed over me, so potent and overwhelming it made me dizzy. It felt like I was taking my first full breath of air after being underwater for a very, very long time. "I thought the same thing," I heard myself say, my voice thick with emotion. "About you. That you were this unattainable person. That I was just the quiet guy on the ground floor. I never, in a million years, thought you would see me." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes, and making them shine. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a look of profound relief that mirrored my own. He closed the small distance that remained between us. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. And then he kissed me. It was nothing like the tentative, questioning touch of the night before. This kiss was sure. It was deep and searching and filled with all the words we had been too afraid to say for months. It was the relief of a confession, the joy of a discovery, and the promise of a beginning, all at once. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss of a first encounter fueled by lust. It was slow, and it was tender, and it tasted of coffee and sandalwood and a profound, bone-deep sense of rightness. It felt like coming home. The days that followed were a strange, wonderful dream. My apartment was still in a state of disarray, a lingering reminder of the chaos that had brought us together, but it no longer felt like a disaster. It felt like a catalyst. Most of my time was spent upstairs, in his world, a world that was quickly, miraculously, becoming ours. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a delicate, exciting process of discovery. We navigated the new dynamic with a kind of gentle reverence, as if handling something precious and fragile. We learned each other outside of our old, self-imposed roles. He wasn't just the mythic architect anymore. He was Liam, the man who hummed off-key when he cooked, who had a ridiculous obsession with historical documentaries, and who fell asleep on the sofa with a book on his chest. And I wasn't just the quiet, anxious neighbor. I was Julian, a man he made laugh with his dry wit, whose design work he genuinely admired, and whose hand he would reach for without thinking while we watched a movie. The intimacy between us deepened not in grand gestures, but in 1,000 small, quiet moments. It was in the easy way we moved around each other in his kitchen, cooking dinner together, my hip bumping against his as I reached for the salt. It was in the comfortable silences, sitting on his balcony at dusk, watching the city lights blink on, no words needed. It was in the casual, constant physical contact, a hand on the small of my back as I walked past, his arms slung around my shoulders on the sofa, my head finding its natural resting place on his shoulder. It was all new and yet felt as old and as natural as breathing. One evening, a week after the storm, we were getting ready for bed. His bed, what was quickly becoming our bed. I was brushing my teeth in his bathroom, watching his reflection in the mirror as he moved around the bedroom, pulling back the duvet. He caught my eye in the glass, and a slow, teasing grin spread across his face. "So," he said, his voice a low, playful rumble. "Are you going to stay on your side of the bed tonight?" I rinsed my mouth and looked back at him, a real, unburdened smile blooming on my face, the first of its kind in what felt like a lifetime. The memory of that night, the fear, the tension, the silent, terrifying hope, was no longer a source of anxiety. It was our origin story, a moment to be cherished. "Not a chance," I said, my voice full of a confidence that was still new to me. I walked into the bedroom, and he opened his arms. I went into them without hesitation, burying my face in the warm curve of his neck, breathing in that familiar, grounding scent of him. He held me tightly, his chin resting on the top of my head. We stood like that for a long time, two halves of a whole, fitted together perfectly in the quiet of the room. Lying there later, in the dark, with his arms securely around me and his steady heartbeat a rhythm against my back, I thought about the life I had lived before, the museum of one, the walls I had so carefully built to protect myself from the pain of rejection, from the messiness of hope. I had mistaken order for safety and solitude for peace. My meticulously curated world had been a prison of my own design. It took a literal flood, a force of nature beyond my control, to wash it all away and leave me exposed, vulnerable, and standing in the hallway where the man I wanted was waiting. He had seen me. In all my panicked, drenched, and displaced chaos, he had seen me, and I had finally allowed myself to be seen. The fear of vulnerability, I realized, wasn't something to be avoided. It was the price of admission. It was the toll you had to pay to cross the bridge from loneliness to connection. And as Liam's hand tightened possessively on my waist, pulling me even closer against him, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that it was the best bargain I had ever made. The chaos had been a gift. The flood had been a baptism. And this quiet, profound feeling of being home, was worth the storm.